3. Missing persons. Stevens shifted uncomfortably, moving his mass from one side of the seat to the other. He blearily opened his eyes and gazed for a moment at the cream-coloured roof of his car before making another determined effort to sleep. Unfortunately, he had a natural aversion to sleeping anywhere but in a bed. He still wasn't quite sure why he had decided to spend the night in a lay-by in Wales. If he'd set off a few hours later, he could have arrived fresh and alert. His arm was rapidly deadening where it was pressed against the door, and Stevens at last gave up his charade. He switched on the light and reached across to the glove compartment, where a thick book had been wedged with no regard to the effect this would have on its pages. He leafed through it idly, wondering what point he had stopped at when he had last been forced to resort to reading it. He had picked it up in a motorway service station, after discovering that it had been penned by an MP under a pseudonym. It contained little of interest. Even the so-called erotic scenes billed on the cover took up only a single page very early on. The tabloids had made a big thing of the whole affair, printing extracts in italics with the occasional word highlighted in capitals. But Stevens had been disappointed to discover that they all heralded from page 63, and the rest of the book was occupied with a rather tame and predictable love story. He propped open the book on the steering wheel, tore off a page corner to chew, and made another effort to read it. He fell asleep. The rising sun finally woke him, and, after retrieving the book from where it had fallen, he started the car and set off down to Gwydir. One hand on the wheel, he searched the radio for something to listen to, but the only signal that came through loud and clear seemed to be a Welsh-language gardening programme. At least, they mentioned rhododendrons a couple of times. It was 7:30 by the time he drove into the small town of Gwydir, and it took him a further 20 minutes to find a cafe that was open, though while driving around he did locate the vet's surgery, locked of course. He sat in the cafe with 2 cups of strong coffee and a bacon sandwich dripping with melted butter, and read a copy of The Spotter that he had found as the sole occupant of a wire-frame newspaper rack. Its front cover bore the headline, "What a Loony!" followed by a story about the President of the United States, who, apparently, had taken to bathing in cranberry sauce. It took all sorts to make a world, Stephen supposed. He polished off his breakfast and prepared to leave, but decided that a second sandwich wouldn't go amiss, or a third for that matter. 8:30 saw him devouring his 5th. That finished, he finally managed to persuade himself that there was such a thing as excess, and left. The vet might be at his surgery now, so Stevens drove round to it, even though it was only 50 yards up the road. Standing in the porch, he rang the doorbell and read the white-on-blue lettering of the small sign. Stuart Taylor, BVSC, held surgeries between 8:30 a.m. and 9:30 a.m, and between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m, apparently. Well, it was 8:37 now, and there was no sign of him. Stevens gave the bell a further ring and drummed his fingers on the frosted glass of the porch window. He turned at the sound of a car drawing up outside. A small woman, wearing a brown cardigan over a blue uniform, got out of the car and came into the porch. "Hello? Is the door not open?" she asked. "No, I'm looking for Mr. Taylor." "Well, just hold on, I've got the key in here somewhere." She rooted through her bag and eventually produced a Yale key. She unlocked the door and held it open for him to follow her through. The waiting room was dominated by dark wooden walls, though the sun shone brightly through windows looking onto the garden outside. An alcove in one wall was cut off from the rest of the room by a desk which carried a cash register and stacks of colourful leaflets. "Stuart's usually here before me. He has surgery at 8:30, you see, but sometimes he has to go out urgently to farms. He'll have left a message for me." She went through a door and emerged behind the reception desk. "What can I do for you?" "I'm a police officer, Inspector Stevens." He showed her his ID. "I just want a word with Mr. Taylor." "There's nothing wrong, is there?" "I'll just see where he is." She rummaged through pieces of paper on a cabinet behind the desk. No, nothing wrong. He phoned me last night and left an interesting message. I'm just following it up. Oh, well, he doesn't appear to have left a note for me. Maybe he's still at home. She picked up the phone, pressed a couple of buttons, and then waited. Stevens could just hear the ringing, but there was no reply. She dropped the phone onto the hook disappointedly. No luck? He asked. No, I can't think where he can be. It's not like him to go without leaving any message for me. Well, I'll come back later. Stevens moistened his lips. I don't suppose you could tell me the address of any, stables that he visited yesterday. He might have mentioned it to you. No, he didn't say anything. She looked uncertain. I'm not sure whether I ought... But you are a police, of course. I don't suppose it can do any harm. She took a green book from under the desk and flipped through the pages. Ah, Tremaine's. Over at Llanfair. That'll be the one. Can you show me where it is? Yes, just come with me. She came out through the door and led him into a tiny office where a map of the area hung on one wall alongside a large notice board. She pointed out the stable on the map. Well, thanks very much, he said. You've been very helpful. Please tell Mr. Taylor that I called, and I'll probably come back again later. He went to the door and stepped out onto the porch. He turned and looked at her standing uncertainly in the middle of the waiting room. Goodbye, he said, and let the door swing shut. Back in his car, he took a look at his watch and decided that it was time to go over and see the policeman in Llanfair Caerog. Hughes, the man's name was. He'd tried to contact him the night before to see if he could follow up the identities of some of the people involved in the coach crash, but to no avail. Hughes hadn't been by his phone then, but surely a village policeman would still be abed at this time in the morning? It took 20 minutes to drive to Llanfair, and in that time the bright morning sunshine was dissipated by a thin cloud cover. The policeman lived on the far side of the village, and Stevens noticed the track up to the stables leading off the road as he passed. It turned out that the policeman's house was a small cottage overlooking the road, its whitewashed walls a dull grey colour from years of weathering. An old bike leant against the wall by the door, its handlebars tangled up amongst a sheet of ivy that clung precariously to any available nooks and crannies. Stevens drove on to the grass verge and walked up the small set of stone steps that led to the front door of the cottage. He knocked briskly on the flakily painted door. A few seconds elapsed before it swung open, accompanied by the smell of frying. "Hello?" The man was tall and broad-shouldered. His greying hair was swept untidily to one side, and stubble speckled his chin. His eyes were bleary. "Constable Hughes?" "That's right, boyo." Stevens took his ID from his breast pocket and showed Hughes. "Inspector Stevens from the Yard. Can I come in?" Hughes hesitated uncertainly, but eventually capitulated. Come on in. Just having me breakfast, you know." Stevens was led into a small kitchen, its tiled walls stained with the signs of frying explosions. A pan simmered on a ring in the corner. "Take a seat, why don't you?" Hughes suggested. He turned to the blue formica-covered work surface. "So, what's this all about?" "You heard about the big coach accident yesterday morning?" A mug was deposited in front of him. "Cup of tea, isn't it?" "Yes, I heard about it. Nasty, I believe." "Very nasty. No survivors. The thing is, the only one we've been able to identify is the driver. He came from Llanfair Caerog." "That's so? What was he called?" "Hughes, like you. Selwyn Hughes." "Know him?" "Selwyn? No, doesn't ring a bell. How did you identify him? Driving licence, was it?" "That's right." Well, he may have lived here a few years ago then. Come to think of it, I do recall a Selwyn being in the pub sometimes. But not recently. Sorry." "You sure? I've got the address somewhere. And these photos of the casualties." Stevens handed over a sheaf of pictures, and Hughes started to leaf through them. He shook his head. "No, nothing I recognise." The thing is, the coach is registered as being owned by a Mr. Emrys Hughes. You Hugheses get around a lot, don't you? Who lives at a place called Dinorban in Llanthair Caerog. Emrys owned a coach, did he? Well, there you go. Selwyn was probably a relative that Emrys was helping to set up in business. Emrys would do things like that. As far as I know, though, Emrys isn't around at the moment, so there's not much point in going on up to Dinorban. Ah, right. Well, you've been very helpful. Stephen stood up and picked up the photographs. I'll probably get in touch with you again. I'll be staying around here, trying to track down any of these faces. Thanks for the tea. Enjoy your breakfast. I'll see myself out. He stood outside the front door thinking. He couldn't be sure, but when he'd first arrived, Hughes had seemed definitely uneasy about something. And then that clumsy attempt to persuade him not to go and see this Emrys. Something was going on here. He walked down and got into his car, turning it in the road. There were certainly inquiries to be pursued here. But first, to see about this unicorn at the stables. Hugh woke and felt Janet's warmth in the bed beside him. So, who was it cooking bacon downstairs? He eased himself out from between the sheets and slipped on his dressing gown. Opening the bedroom door quietly, he paid a quick visit to the bathroom and then went down to the kitchen. "Morning, Hugh," the doctor said cheerily. "A good night's sleep, I hope." "Yes, thanks. You're up early." "Time is relative," the doctor told him. "I've been up all night." "Ah," Hugh nodded. "So it was you we heard playing rock and roll on the record player at 2 this morning." "At 2?" the doctor asked, surprised. "Oh dear. I think I'd better have a word with Ace about these antisocial behaviour patterns. I went out at 12 to track the spoor of our visitor." "That was a bit dangerous, wasn't it?" "I don't think so. No, not really." The doctor looked out of the window at the lush green hillside, the dewed grass glimmering in the sunlight. "Anyway, at 2 I was stargazing up in the hills." His eyes gleamed, and Hugh found himself looking into eternity within their dark orbits. The sky was beautifully clear. The Milky Way, a bold stroke of the Creator's spray can across the heavens. There was a meteor shower from the direction of Aquarius. The music of the spheres was being played by a full orchestra. "A good night, then?" "The best." The doctor returned his attention to the frying pan. "Eggs, bacon, tomato, and fried bread be enough for you?" "I've just put the kettle on." "I think that should be just about adequate. Ready in a few minutes, then." "Right. I'll go and rouse Janet." Hugh disappeared through the kitchen door. "Wicked smell, Professor," Ace announced herself. "What's cooking, Doc?" "Ace, I hear you've been boogieing the night away." "Oh, yeah. I just had a look at their record collection. There's some groovy stuff there, you know. Bill Haley, Eddie Cochran, Buddy Holly. They've even got some Cliff. I never really believed he was around back in those days." "There are those of us who bear our accumulated years quite well," the doctor told her. "But really, Ace, you shouldn't play records in other people's houses when they're trying to sleep." "Right-o, Professor. I'll bear that in mind. Those eggs look good enough to eat." The doctor took a look. "Ah, yes, pass me a few plates quickly." He dished out portions onto 2 plates. "Go and give Janice and Hugh a shout, Ace." "Oh, needn't bother. I hear them descending even as we speak." Hugh and Janet came in, still wearing their night clothes. "This is quite a treat," Janet said, sitting down at the table. "Breakfast is served," Ace proclaimed, setting a plate in front of Hugh with a flourish. "I used to be a waitress, you know," she confided. "Yes, I believe you were fired, weren't you?" the doctor commented. "Nobody's perfect, Professor." "There you are, Janet." "Thank you, dear." "Hey, Professor," Ace complained. "You haven't done any for us." "You noticed that, did you, Ace? I didn't think you'd need any after your midnight visit to the fridge." Ace protested. "It was just a snack, Professor." "We'll have an early start, Ace." He picked up his hat from the table and set it upon his head. "You can have something when we get back from looking round Emrys Hughes's land. With any luck, he'll still be eating his breakfast too." Ace gave a loud whoop as she ran down the slope from the ridge that separated the two valleys. As she neared the bottom, her momentum became too much for her, and the weight of her rucksack sent her tumbling head over heels, leaving her in a crumpled heap at the foot of the hill. The doctor followed more sedately, but Ace was still cursing to herself when he reached her and helped her to her feet. "There are some ways of descending hills that are more decorous for a young lady than others, my dear Ace," he told her, flicking a few pieces of wet grass from her black jacket. "I bet they're all boring, though, aren't they?" Ace retorted, her enthusiasm for speed over stateliness undiminished. "You could be right. Now then, the village is this way. Am I right?" Ace pulled a face. "The trees all look the same to me." "Nonsense, Ace. The oak is a world apart from the slender birch, the manic depressive willow, and the witch's bane, the trusty rowan. I shall lead on, from the front as it were." He moved off into the green-shaded underworld, looking about carefully, in no way eager to encounter Emrys and his rifle. "My unerring sense of direction will lead us directly to Dinorban, ancient home of farmers bearing the red rose." He turned and gave Ace a hard stare in return for the derisive laugh she had offered him. She smiled innocently and waved him on. The first indication that the village had been reached was a large stone with a velvety covering of moss that lay embedded in the soft earth. The doctor knelt by it momentarily and then moved to a further pile of stones a few metres on. Ace paused by the first stone and, digging her fingers under it, levered it out of its indentation. A worm glared at her and then proceeded about its business. She flipped the rock back into place and then went over to the doctor. "Definitely part of a building," he said. "And there are quite a lot of these lying around." "Yeah, all over the place. There's a well somewhere." "Shall we go and have a look?" "Yeah, come on. I think it's over here." Ace led him through the trees towards the well. Before they reached it, however, they intercepted the track to the stone circle. "Look, Ace." The doctor pointed at the churned mud of the track. "Tyre prints! They weren't there yesterday." "And what about all the footprints? Were they?" Ace looked closely. The tyre marks overlaid a great many footprints. "There were some." "Do you notice anything about them?" Ace peered at them, wondering what the doctor could be trying to make her see. She bit her lower lip and shook her head. But then she had an idea. "The tyre marks are over the footprints, so they must have been made after them." "Yes. Anything else?" "There's only one set of tyre marks. They're only going one way. Is there a through road?" "Dunno." "Well, is there anything else you notice?" "Not really, no." "All of the shoes of these people who trampled around here were cobbled. Look, you can tell from the imprints. They've got primitive grips on the soles, and on some of them you can see where the nails were sticking out. Now, even in this part of the world, I'd expect someone who was coming out for a jolly night in the woodlands to wear something more like a pair of Wellingtons." "Oh, yeah. So what? I just thought I'd mention it. You never can tell when such information might come in useful. Now, where's this well?" "Over here." Ace took the doctor into the trees on the other side of the track and led him to where the remains of the well lay. The doctor looked at it with interest. "Well, well, well." "3 holes in the ground?" said Ace. "What?" "Nothing. What do you think?" "I'm surprised that in more than a century its walls haven't collapsed." He looked up. "Nothing more to be seen here. Let's go and take a look at the circle of stones." They went back to the track and followed it to its conclusion at the small circle of low granite slabs. The doctor considered the stones one by one, and then spoke his thoughts to Ace. "Interesting. What appear to be the key stones are situated in entirely the wrong places, when one takes into account the local geography. Here's another test of observation for you, Ace. Go and see if you can find a third stone as large as these two on either side of the circle. If there is one, it'll probably be a few meters away from the outside of the ring. Look, Professor, the tire marks stop here. They just vanish. Strange, though I believe there may be a perfectly good explanation. Well, what is it? You go and look for that stone, Ace. I'll tell you when I'm certain, and not before. Like you always do. Go on, Ace. She nodded and stalked off. The doctor wandered round the edge of the circle until he was by one of the two large stones which stood on opposite sides, facing each other. He knelt down by it and examined it closely. After a couple of seconds, he stood up, removed his hat, and balanced it on top of the adjacent stone. He crouched down by the stone again and looked at it at close range. It was covered on one side by moss that had crept up in a mat from the ground, and on the other side by explosions of lichen, yellow, green, and brown. From his pocket, he took a small knife and clicked it open. He scratched at the surface covering and sniffed at the fragments of plant material that fell into his hand. Then, methodically, he started to remove the lichen from a large area of the surface. Finally, satisfied with his work, he sat back and gazed at the exposed area. Gradually, as though the sunlight falling on the bare rock was the cause, small moving flashes of light on the rock became apparent. But were they on the surface of the rock? Was it merely a strange optical effect that made them appear as though they were buried deep within its heart, following stress lines within the silicon itself? One flash in particular drew the doctor's attention. It sped across the rock and, like an electron passing through a cloud chamber, it left a track behind itself which slowly faded. And, just when the pathway had almost gone, the flash repeated itself. The doctor extended his forefinger and ran it along the abrasive surface, pressing it so that small particles of his skin were left behind. He pulled his finger away, waiting until just before the flash was about to appear, and then with reflexes timed to the millisecond, he pressed his finger in the path of the flash. And when it hit, it was diverted, sparking off along a new trajectory, setting off bright new flashes as it went. Behind him, the doctor felt a shifting in the air. He took his finger away and allowed the flash to resume its former pathway. The disturbance behind him halted. That was the confirmation he needed. Further affirmation could be dangerous to acquire, and the TARDIS's tracking systems, providing they were operational, could be used to get the information he needed with greater reliability and safety. A feeling of excitement touched the doctor's thoughts. He had here a device which, if it could be linked into the TARDIS's circuits, could restore the ailing link with the Eye of Harmony on Gallifrey. There was the problem of finding an adequately sensitive organic matrix to provide the connection, which could regenerate the block transfer circuit, but here at least was a partial solution to the TARDIS's problems. He stood up from his work and turned to survey the circle. "Ace!" he called. "Yes?" Her voice was muffled by the intervening foliage and came from beyond the far edge of the circle. "Come here, Ace. I've got something to show you," he shouted to her. "All right, coming," she replied. He heard her making her way towards him, and eventually she appeared from amongst the trees. "I couldn't find another stone," she said. "No, I didn't think you would." "Then why did you—" "Never mind. What did you want to show me?" "This." He gestured towards the stone. She started across the clearing to look. "Oh, yeah. What is it?" "What we have here is a semi-organic silicate computer transfer device that has—" "No, Ace, don't go through the centre!" The air stirred briefly. In the woods, a branch fell from a tree, but there was no one there to hear it. Old Davy paused, one leg over the stile. He cocked his head to one side. His eyes eased shut, and he took a suck on his upper lip. Slowly, his head began to nod as ancient motors in his mind connected thoughts together. Suddenly, he completed the movement over the stile and continued his journey down towards his regular appointment with the bench outside the pub. He knew what he had heard. Gossamer touch of a butterfly's wings crashing together and silenced in a moment.